to switch from screen sharing back to her screen to present to us.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for your patience. So I am here to speak with you this morning in honor of Evolution Weekend. So Evolution Weekend is an outgrowth of the Clergy Letter Project, which Kathy mentioned at the start of the worship. Which is a statement by thousands of faith leaders from across numerous denominations and other faith traditions, non-Christian as well, which is why it's now Evolution Weekend rather than Sunday, because not all faiths celebrate on Sunday. It's a statement that these faith leaders find no conflict between the teachings of their faith and the teachings of science. And indeed, that when religion is defined so narrowly as to be actively opposed to scientific knowledge, including specifically evolution and climate change, that doing so demeans and diminishes religion. Evolution Weekend specifically is a dedicated time each year in the second week of February around Charles Darwin's birthday for serious discussion and reflection on the relationship between religion and science to show that they are two complementary ways of understanding the world and that there is no inherent conflict between the two. I've had the privilege of leading conversations for Evolution Weekend at UCUP most years since I think about 2012, actually. I took last year off, and I'm really glad to have the chance to share some thoughts with you this year. So, when I was thinking about a theme to try and tie Evolution Weekend together with our series Drawn In on creativity, my starting place was the idea of emergence. So, emergence is a concept used in both science and art to describe an entity possessing properties that its component parts don't exhibit independently. So, emergence is when disparate elements come together to create something that is only possible through their interaction. Quite literally, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. To give one example, life can be described as an emergent property of chemistry. So, molecules interacting in a way that creates a cell we recognize as alive when none of the biological molecules making it up are independently living. And when I think about emergence as a concept, to me, I always marvel at just the vast and wondrous complexities that can arise out of the repetition and interaction of otherwise very simple rules. So, for example, physics describes a number of basic laws, I've shown a few of them here, that dictate how matter and energy behave, how gravitational and magnetic forces act, how subatomic particles come together to create each element that makes up our universe. And out of the combination of these firm, clear, relatively simple descriptions emerges vast complexity, the glory of the entire universe, from the farthest reaches of uncharted space to wonders at our very fingertips. Genetics, a field I'm a little more directly familiar with, describes laws of inheritance, statistical properties for how genes and traits arise and spread within a population of organisms. And out of the combination of these mathematical descriptions of potential emerges the stunning diversity of living things, ever changing, ever becoming something glorious and new. To change directions for a moment from science towards something perhaps a bit closer to art, Crochet patterns describe a series of simple stitches in specific numbers and relation to one another, prescribed ways to move a hook around, between, and through pieces of yarn. And out of application of these basic instructions emerges art and craft, objects beautiful and useful, and usually when I'm doing it, a bit whimsical. And now I'm going to ask you to bear with me for a bit as I offer a reflection on my creative process without the benefit of Tom offering guiding questions or skillful editing. So you just get me unfiltered. So I've never considered myself to be an artistic person. Creative, yes, but not artistic. My medium has always been words. When it comes to visual creativity, I struggle. I can't draw or paint. I can't envision an image and bring it into being. My thoughts come in words, never pictures. What I can do, though, is follow instructions meticulously and watch something emerging from the application of repeated patterns. Maybe it's close enough to science, right? You know, building things up from molecules and making something out of them. I've sometimes described this as the difference between sculpting a statue out of clay and building something out of Legos, right? I can follow instructions, take defined pieces, and make a thing, but I need those instructions. I need those pieces. And that's, to me, all crochet is either. It's just following patterns. There's absolutely no innate talent required for my creativity with yarn. The skills are easily learned. It just takes patience and time and sometimes a bit of counting, but that's pretty manageable. But that doesn't mean there can't be wonder and beauty in it. It's something I do both because I love bringing things into being to share with others. I've kept almost nothing that I've made over the several years I've been crocheting. And also because I enjoy simply the act of making, following instructions on a page and watching an object emerge from just the patterns of movements. There's a wonder to that. Even when it's just a simple repeated pattern, seeing something spun out of formlessness. There's something freeing in simply the repeated action itself as well. Repeated movements, muscle memory. It requires little conscious thought and frees the mind to wander. I've never practiced meditation, but I wonder sometimes if the space that I get into when crocheting brings me a similar experience. And now, if I can get my technology to cooperate, I'll let you judge for yourselves on that and watch my hands for a bit while I give you the next part of my reflection. The yarn I'm going to be working with is a type that I have used several times for prayer blankets or prayer shawls. So again, this is something that I find very just a repeated meditative process and kind of making the act of creation, in this case, into an act of prayer. So when Kathy asked a few weeks ago if I would incorporate Evolution Weekend into this series on creation, I'll admit I hesitated. I have a knee-jerk reaction to the term creation being used in the context of origins of life. It comes with some unfavorable associations with pseudoscience being forced into classrooms, displacing an undermining teaching of evolutionary science. I've been in biology long enough to remember the push for creation science before it got repackaged as intelligent design in an attempt to skirt court rulings on separation of church and state in public education. In fact, my freshman writing center or seminar was taught by the chair of biology at Illinois Wesleyan University and was a course that he entitled Science and Non-Science, although I admit it sometimes got rebranded in the class as Science and Nonsense. But we spent a lot of that semester exploring texts on creation science, books, critically evaluating these books that distorted and misrepresented scientific understanding to promote a religious belief in a literal reading of Genesis, trying to use science to justify a 6,000-year-old world filled with living things that had come into existence in their current forms, sculpted into being directly as they are and always have been. And this is what, creation in the context of evolution has always meant to me. And to my mind, and in the thinking of the more than 17,000 faith leaders that have signed on to the Clergy Letter Project, this act of deliberately tying religious belief to ignorance both rejects the capacity for learning that God has granted us and diminishes our understanding of God into what Kenneth Miller refers to in his book, Finding Darwin's God, as a charlatan or a magician. And talking about origins of life as creation has always felt hollow to me, both as a scientist and as a Christian. So, what changed then? Why am I here talking to you today, Evolution Weekend, as part of this series on creation? Well, in our worship planning meetings, as we were putting together the Drawn In series, one of the themes that kept emerging was talking about creative process, right? That's something Tom would be asking people about in their interviews, and that we wanted to think about creation as a process and an ongoing action rather than a final product. And that's what clicked for me. I mean, isn't that what evolution is? God's creative process. Through a lens of theistic evolution, God's act of creation is an ongoing action, a continual unfolding of creative output rather than the finite molding of a defined, prescribed set of products. It's not a static endpoint. It's a never-ending, fluid procession of new wonders. That's a form of creation. That's a God of creation that I can believe in and revere. Was anyone else counting during Dorothy's reading of the first book of Genesis how many times God proclaimed creation good? In case you weren't counting, and I can completely understand being absorbed in Dorothy's images instead, by my count, it was 7. 7 times that God calls creation good. And they weren't all saved for the end either. God didn't wait to see a finished product to declare creation good. At each step, each new facet of creation, God proclaimed this work in progress to be good. Genesis 1 also tells us that humanity was created in God's image to reflect God's nature, to be godlike. I admit, those sound like pretty daunting instructions sometimes, but maybe we'll try to see what we can make of them. So, what is it we are being called to do to reflect God's nature? Well, the explicit command given in the text is to be responsible for the beings and world of God's creation. That's a lot in and of itself. I think that could make an entire worship series on its own. But the lip minor training in me is always looking for more subtle interpretations in a text, meanings that aren't explicitly stated. So, in addition to what we're told to do in order to be more godlike, what else can we get from this text? Perhaps we can learn from example, modeling God's actions. So, in this first book of the Bible, what do we see God do in that first chapter? We see God create. And perhaps even more importantly, we see God deem the work of God's creation good at every step, even when incomplete. So, in order to strive to be more godlike, maybe that's an example we need to follow. To value the process of creating for more than just the worthiness of what we end up making. We need to see the work of our hands and hearts and know, as God knows, that it is good. It is good solely for the joy and peace and catharsis that the creative act brought us. Our acts of creation are good, regardless of whether they produce something that is useful or beautiful or even finished. And I want you to watch and recognize that the beauty and peace found in the process of making isn't retroactively erased, even when it's not finished, even when the yarn unravels back to formlessness. It's too easy, I think, to, at least for me certainly, to see an unfinished creative undertaking as a mark of failure, to feel ashamed or guilty when we look at the scraps of fabric that never became a quilt, the pile of index cards that never became a novel. But what if we view these incomplete or imperfect creations through a godlike lens? What if I look at these partial quilt blocks not as unworthy for not being a usable quilt, but as a reminder of the joy I found in designing their mathematical precision, a reminder of the way that working with them brought me closer to the memory of my grandmother? What if I see that pile of outline cards not as a mark of many wasted hours, but as tangible evidence of the thought and creative exploration that went into shaping an as yet unwritten world and narrative, as a tangible reminder of the friendships forged and deepened with the people who encouraged my writing and ideas, two of whom I think are here today. So thanks, guys. What if we collectively celebrate the creative process as good in and of itself? What if, like the God of Genesis, we learn to see our every act of creation as good, even when we are still in the midst of the creating, even when what we are trying to do is a formless soup of nothingness? What if we give ourselves permission to let go of expectations and simply take joy in the process of becoming godlike through the act of creation, knowing that what we make, whatever we make, is good, so very good. May it be so. May we work to make it be so.